we're going to focus on chapter 6 and 7 in this lecture. Here we get a really good description of Joe and Pip's relationship. And so they've returned all excited, from all the excitement and everything. And we get some more entertainment with Mr. Pumblechook and so on. But I want you to focus on page 37, the second chapter, where so Pip is absolutely laden with guilt, okay? And this is going to be something that we're going to see throughout the novel, that he is absolutely tormented by guilt. But it doesn't motivate him to do the right thing, okay? I mean, sometimes it does, but usually it just, makes him feel awful about doing the wrong thing, but not able to do the right thing. So here he says, but I loved Joe, perhaps for no better reason in those early days than because the dear fellow let me love him. And as to him, my inner self was not so easily composed. So, he is ambivalent about his relationship with Joe. It was much upon my mind, particularly when I first saw him looking about for his file, that I ought to tell Joe the whole truth. Yet I did not, and for the reason that I mistrusted that if I did, he would think me worse than I was. The fear of losing Joe's confidence, and of thenceforth sitting in the chimney corner at night, staring drearily at my forever lost companion and friend, tied up my tongue. And so but there's this, almost feeling of wistfulness. You remember, he's looking back on his life and what are his feelings for Joe, and just kind of all of the times as a child that he thought things and said things and did things, and as an adult he can't take those things back. In chapter 7, we're introduced to the topic of education, okay? And, we've already seen a little bit about Pip's perception of the letters on the tombstone and how this, shapes his conception of his parents, right? But, Pip brings us back to the tombstones here again to describe the act of creating meaning from words, right? And I mean, that's what reading is, right? It's like creating meaning out of these just sort of arbitrary shapes. It's just so interesting, right? But that's language. That's what language is. And so we have this, and Dickens has a lot to say about some of the injustice in the education system in England, and it gets better in the 19th century by far, but there is still great room for criticism, because largely the education system is for rich people, and even then mostly for boys, okay? There is very little education for girls, except for, within the home, and then it'd be very, sort of homemaking kinds of activities. And the public schools in particularly that are get funding and stuff, they're like for wealthy boys. That's it, okay? If you've read any other sort of 19th century novels, maybe you've read Jane Eyre, maybe you've read Middlemarch, I'm not sure, different ones. But there are often these, boarding schools that have the building conditions are really poor. There's not adequate heat. There's not adequate food. The teachers are abusive. All these kinds of things. Okay, so Dickens, takes kind of a poke at all of this in this. And also it's important because remember, we're talking about a Bildungsroman, which is, a novel kind of growing up. And so part of Pip's development, and a really important part, is education, okay? But one of the things that's interesting is that really there are two types of education that Pip is going to get, okay? So he's going to be educated in moral education and academic education. And Joe, is the primary source or teacher of his moral education. We're also going to meet Biddy, I think, in this chapter, and she as well is involved in his moral education. But, it's mostly the academic education that he's interested in, right? But, if you read through chapter 7, it's just so lovely, just the compassion, the empathy that we witness in Joe as he describes, his abusive alcoholic father, and just this beautiful poem that he, created for his father. And, Joe is absolutely the paragon of morality in the novel. his educational deficits do not take away from his moral uprightness. And we can see this lovely scene in chapter 7. There's other reference to catechism, which is kind of like religious teaching, and it's not exactly clear, how that may or may not shape his morality. But basically, I think that the biggest thing is that Pip has no idea what they're talking about half the time. So, for example, if you look on chapter 7, page 39, so he talks about his theological positions to which my catechism bound me at all accurate. For I have a lively remembrance that I supposed my declaration that I was to walk in the same all the days of my life laid me under an obligation always to go through the village from our house in one particular direction, and never to vary it by turning down by the wheelwrights or up by the mill. And the passage, it's in a common prayer book, and it's that, teach me your way and I will walk in it all the days of my life, or something to this effect, right? But it's a prayer to God saying that, like, I'll walk in the way that you have destined for me. And Pip doesn't get that there's this sort of spiritual thing, so he thinks that he has to take the exact same path from, his place to town every time. He can't deviate from it. And so, that's kind of just a bit of a comical thing, but I think that Dickens is poking a little bit at the education system, particularly the religious education system, when they'd often teach in Latin and Greek, and, using language that was really not accessible for these young people. We also get introduced here to Mr. Wopsel's great aunt, who is entirely deficient for teaching these young lads. And we get just a couple, and he really satirizes this, Dickens. So we learn that she was a ridiculous old woman of limited means and unlimited infirmity, who used to go to sleep from 6 to 7 every evening in the society of youth who paid 2d per week each for the improving opportunity of seeing her do it. She had no, okay, so then it talks about her other business and stuff. And anyway, so basically it's a bit of a gong show, this little school. We're going to read more about it in another chapter, but if it wasn't for her niece Biddy, there'd be like no educating that's going on at all, okay? So we're going to continue to explore the theme of education in the novel and see how Pip's education prepares him or does not prepare him for his future, okay?